Between 1500 and 1350 BCE, a number of states emerged across the eastern Mediterranean. Each of these states developed due to internal dynamics, often driven by the ambitions and leadership of individual kings. They rose from the instability of the previous era, often referred to as a Dark Age, first securing control over their core territories before turning to expansion. These expansions inevitably sparked conflicts among neighboring powers, shaping the region's history into a series of wars and rivalries. Key powers regularly changed. Initially, it was Egypt versus Mitani, followed by Egypt and the Hittites, and later the Hittites and the Assyrians. Much of this conflict centered around Syria, a contested frontier between empires. But tensions weren't confined to Syria alone. In the east, Elam, Babylonia, and Assyria clashed with one another, while in the west, the Mycenaeans came into conflict with the Hittites. One example of these power struggles is the history of Mitani. Among the earliest to rise, the Mitani kingdom dominated northern Syria for roughly 150 years. Its main rival early on was Egypt. However, Egypt's northern military campaigns never crossed the Euphrates River. Doing so would have meant invading the core of Mitani territory. Instead, the two powers competed indirectly, each trying to gain influence over client states in northwestern Syria. Their rivalry came to an end shortly before 1400 BCE, when the Egyptian king Amenhotep II, ruling from 1426 to 1400 BCE, married the daughter of the Mitani king Artatama. Even 50 years later, Mitani still held significant influence, and Egypt's kings treated Tushratta, Mitani's ruler at the time, as their equal. Still, diplomatic letters from this period, known as the Amarna letters, reveal unrest within Mitani. Different branches of the royal family vied for control, and their internal struggles spilled onto the international stage as each faction sought outside support. The resulting situation was chaotic. What we know comes primarily from foreign sources, as internal Mitani records are scarce. Late in the reign of Amenhotep III, 1390 to 1353 BCE, Tushratta wrote to the Egyptian king, addressing him as a friend. While the letter mainly served to announce the arrival of gifts for Amenhotep and his wife, Keluhiba Tushratta's sisterhood also included a personal account of how Tushratta came to power. When I inherited the throne from my father, I was still young. Yuthi had committed many wrongs in my land. He had murdered his king. Because of this, he isolated me from forming alliances with anyone who might have supported me. But I did not turn a blind eye to these crimes. I took action and executed the murderers of my brother Arteshamara, along with all their followers. Because you were my father's ally, I'm writing to let you know what happened, so that you, my brother, may hear it and be glad. My father loved you, and you loved him. Out of that bond he gave you my sister in marriage. Who else had such a relationship with my father? Tushratta had been placed on the throne of Mitani by Yuthitha, the very man who had murdered his brother, but he later turned on Yuthi and killed him. In his letter to Egypt, Tushratta sought to strengthen diplomatic ties, but his position remained unstable. Challenged his authority and declared himself king with support from the Hittite ruler Suppiluliuma. Artatama's son, Shotarna III, assassinated Tushratta and seized control of the royal palace. The version of events we know best comes from the side that ultimately gained power. Though at the cost of aligning with the Hittites, the source is a treaty between Shatawaza, the son of Tushratta, and new king of Mitani. In Suppiluliuma Ith, this treaty survives in two versions, one told from Shatawaza's perspective and the other from Suppiluliuma's. Both were written in Hittite and Babylonian and preserved in the Hittite capital's archives. Each version recounts the events differently, which adds complexity but also gives a more complete picture of the political and military chaos of the time. In the historical preamble to the treaty, Shatawaza recounts, before Shotarna, son of Artatama, disrupted the order in Mitani, his father had already acted dishonorably. Artatama gave away the royal palace and its treasures to Assyria and Alsh. That palace once built and filled with riches by my father. King Tushratta was stripped bare and destroyed by Shatarna. He dismantled the symbols of royalty, melted down gold and silver, and even took the silver basins from the royal bath. He gave nothing to his father or brother, but instead bowed down to the Assyrian king, who had once been a servant of my father and no longer paid tribute and sent him lavish gifts. In doing so, he brought about the downfall of the Hurrian people. Akitasheb fled from him to the land of Kardunish Babylonia, taking 200 chariots with him. But the Babylonian king seized both the men and their possessions and reduced Akitasheb's status, treating him like a common charioteer. He even tried to kill him. Ishatawaza, son of King Tushrata, was also targeted for assassination, but managed to escape. I called upon the gods of your majesty, Supaloliama, the great king of Hatti, the beloved champion of the storm god Teshub. The gods led me safely on a road without direction. The deities of Hatti and Mitani guided me until I reached your majesty, Supaloliama, great king of Hatti, favored of Teshub. Shadawuz's account tells the following story. To secure his hold on the throne, Shatarna, son of Artatama, sided with the Assyrians, who had once been under Mitani's influence. He took over the palace built by Tushrata and used its treasures to win favor with Assyria. He also purged the kingdom's military leadership. One commander, Akitasheb, managed to escape to Babylonia with 200 chariots and took Shatawaza with him. However, the Babylonian king likely burned a Buriash, confiscated everything and tried to kill both Akitasheb and Shatawaza. They managed to flee and eventually reached the court of the Hittite king Suppiluma. The treaty continues by describing what happened after Shatawaza arrived in the Hittite court, empty-handed and in exile. Supiluma welcomed him and offered military support, assigning his son, Prince Piasili, to aid him. Together, they sent emissaries to various Mitani cities, trying to form alliances. However, Shatarna III had already bribed many locals to support his claim to power. As a result, Shatawaza and Piasili had to fight, and they succeeded in capturing several cities in northern Syria. When the Assyrians later besieged the Mitani capital, Washukani, the people there turned to Shatawaza and Piasili for help. Their arrival forced the Assyrian army to retreat. Unfortunately, the final part of the story, including Shatarna's defeat, has been lost. After his victory, Shatawaza became a vassal of Supiluma, but he retained a degree of honor and status. Mitani wasn't reduced to a mere client state. Instead, it became a protectorate, which allowed Shatawaza to present his rise to power with dignity. Still, Supilum's version of events paints a different picture. He portrays himself as a triumphant conqueror who chose a royal Mitani figure to act as his representative. He describes Tushata as his father, as an arrogant ally who became angry when Hittite raids reached west of the Euphrates. Supiluma claims he crossed into Mitani territory, plundered Washukani, and caused Tushrata to flee. After this, the Hittites launched a major campaign throughout the region west of the Euphrates. The turning point came with a palace coup in Mitani. Shatarna III, son of Artatama II, murdered Tushrata and took the throne with Assyrian backing. He also tried to kill Shatawaza, who escaped and sought refuge with Supiluma. According to the Hittite king, the god Teshub is rendered judgment. Because I took Shatawaza, son of King Tushata, under my protection, I will place him on his father's throne, so that the great land of Mitani would not be destroyed. I, the great king of Hatti, gave life back to it for the sake of my daughter. I took Shatawaza by the hand and gave him my daughter as his wife. By this point, Supiluma had firmly established military control over Syria west of the Euphrates and held dominance over Mitani's king. Although he originally supported the royal line of Artatama II, that alliance collapsed when its members sided with Assyria. In response, Supiluma shifted his support to Tushrata's son. His success, however, was short-lived. Death. A devastating plague struck the Hittite kingdom, and Shatawaza severed ties with the Hittites. Without his cooperation, he could no longer influence Mitani's affairs. In the late 14th century BCE, the Hittite king Murseli II ruling 1321 to 1295, lamented, "The nearby protectorates, Mitani and Arzawa, have all risen in revolt. They no longer honor the gods. They have broken sacred oaths and seek to plunder the temples. May this give the gods even more reason for vengeance. Let them send plagues, rebellion, famine, and deadly disease upon Mitani and Arzawa." Pressure on Mitani from Assyria had already begun during the reign of Suppilulium's contemporary, Suar-Ubalid I, ruling 1363 to 1328. Though not mentioned directly in the treaties, his actions triggered Hittite involvement in Mitanni's internal politics. Assur-Ubalid likely broke Assyria free from Mitanni's control, and then tried to interfere in its royal succession. The Hittites' response seemed to have ended that influence temporarily. But after Suppilulium's death, Assyria may have regained dominance over Mitani. This is how the Assyrian king Adad-nirari, ruling 1305 to 1274, portrayed the situation in one of his inscriptions. Referring to Mitani as Hanigalbat, he wrote, "When Shatura, king of Hanigalbat, rebelled and committed evil acts, I captured him and brought him to my city, Osur, under the command of my god Osur and the other great gods who guide me. I made him swear an oath and sent him back to his land. Long as he lived, he paid me annual tribute in Osur. After his death, his son Wasashata also rebelled and did evil. He turned to the Hittites for help, offering them bribes. But the Hittites accepted the gifts and gave him no support. Shatuara. I was likely the son of Shatuaza. And according to the account of the Assyrian king Adad-nirari, he became a vassal of the Assyrian Empire. When his own son, Wasashata, rebelled, he appealed to the Hittites for support. However, they were preoccupied with their own conflict against Egypt and provided no assistance. Adad-nirari launched a military campaign across Mitani, advancing all the way to the Euphrates. He captured Wasashata and his family and brought them back to Assur, although Adad-nirari claimed to have brought the entire population under his control. His successor, Shalmaneser, the first ruling 1273 to 1244 BCE, still had to send another army to the region. It's time to face a new leader, Shatuara II. Despite receiving aid from the Hittites and the Elamu nomads, Shatuara II was defeated. Shalmaneser, I describe the campaign in dramatic terms, by command of the great gods and with the mighty strength of Assur. My lord, I marched to Hanigalbat. I opened paths and crossed difficult terrain. Shtuara, king of Hanigalbat, along with the armies of Hatti and the Elamu, had blocked the mountain passes and taken control of my water sources. When my soldiers were exhausted and parched, their forces launched a fierce attack, but I pushed them back and defeated them. I slaughtered a great number of their troops. I pursued their king with arrows until nightfall. I butchered the armies of Hatti and the Elamu like sheep. With this, Mitani's independence effectively ended. Its territory was divided. The Hittites controlled the lands west of the Euphrates, while the Assyrians took control of the eastern side. Syria then used the region as a base for military campaigns heading north and west. These conflicts continued through the end of the 13th century. Tukulti-Ninurta, the first ruling 1243 to 1207 BCE, even crossed the Euphrates to wage war against the Hittites. And the rivalry between the two powers came to define life in northern Syria during this time. The Assyrians maintained their control east of the Euphrates by establishing administrative centers and systematically exploiting the land. However, this rule came to an end after Tukulti-Ninurta's assassination, which triggered a period of chaos in Assyria. As a result, the Mitani region briefly regained independence, but without any unified political structure. The biggest beneficiaries of this instability were the Arameans, who eventually came to dominate northern Syria politically. The history of Mitani clearly illustrates how internal politics within one kingdom could become a matter of international importance. A dynastic rivalry between two branches of the royal family provided an opening for foreign powers to interfere. Each side in the conflict sought outside support, and in turn, foreign allies could shift their loyalties depending on what was most advantageous at the time. Mitani factions themselves were not consistent either. They changed allegiance when it suited their interests or attempted to cast off foreign influence whenever possible. When a foreign backer was distracted by other matters, support would vanish. While Mitani's transformation from a powerful kingdom to a dependent protectorate was significant. The phenomenon itself wasn't unique. Similar patterns of internal conflict drawing in external powers occurred throughout the region. No kingdom in this period existed in isolation. The broader context was one of ongoing competition between major states, though direct confrontations were rare. Instead, powers like the Hittites and Assyrians fought proxy wars by backing opposing sides in local conflicts. This dynamic was common not only in Mitani, but also in the Syro-Palestinian region and beyond, continuing for centuries. There was, however, one important exception to this pattern: the Battle of Qadesh, the road to Kadesh, most well known. Battle of this entire era was fought between the Hittite king Muwatalli and his Egyptian counterpart, Ramesses II, near the city of Kadesh in central Syria. This battle, which took place in 1275 BCE, marked the climax of a prolonged struggle between Egypt and the Hittite Empire over control of the Syro-Palestine region. Although Ramesses II suffered a defeat or at best fought to a stalemate, he later turned the confrontation at Kadesh into a symbol of glory. He immortalized it through detailed accounts and grand depictions on temples and monuments, making it the first battle in world history from which we have such a rich and detailed narrative. For historians, the significance of the Battle of Qadesh lies in the fact that it was a direct military confrontation between two great powers, Egypt and Hatti, rather than a proxy war fought through smaller allied states. Up until then, most major late Bronze Age conflicts had been fought indirectly. The battle was all but inevitable. The Hittite expansion into Syria, begun under Suppiluliuma, had been both deliberate and highly successful. His heirs continued the fight to hold on to the territory he had won, resisting repeated Egyptian attempts to push back. Suppilulium's campaign had started in the mid-14th century BCE, shortly after he ascended to the throne. He first secured the region bordering Anatolia and Syria, then pressured the northern Syrian city-states to abandon their loyalty to Egypt and swear allegiance to him instead. During this time, the kingdom of Habiru, located at the northern edge of Egypt's sphere of influence, played a central role. Although Habiru's rulers were officially Egyptian vassals, many neighboring states accused its king, Habiru, of secretly supporting the Hittites. The Egyptians launched an investigation into these allegations, but ultimately cleared Habiru's decision that would prove to be a serious error. Not long afterward, Habiru formally allied himself with Suppiluliuma by signing a vassal treaty. In it, Suppiluliuma acknowledged, because Habiru submitted himself at my majesty's feet and abandoned Egypt's frontiers to do so, I, the great king, raised Habiru and placed him as king among his brothers. Suppiluliuma also placed a loyal client ruler in Kadesh, a key city just south of Habiru. Kadesh was a highly strategic location. It sat on the Orontes River, which flowed along the eastern edge of the mountain range that separated inland Syria from the Mediterranean coast. Controlling Kadesh meant controlling the only reliable inland north-south trade and military route through the region, by gaining influence over both Habiru and Kadesh. The Hittites significantly limited Egyptian power in northern Syria. Despite this, the Egyptians did not respond with force at least not immediately. During the reign of Tutankhamun, an Egyptian military expedition may have been sent against Kadesh, but it achieved little. Meanwhile, Egypt was facing internal upheaval. After the sudden death of Tutankhamun, his widow wrote to Suppiluliuma, requesting that he send one of his sons to become her husband. Though cautious, the Hittite king eventually agreed and sent a young prince. However, the prince was assassinated soon after arriving in Egypt. This act revealed deep political divisions in the Egyptian court, where some factions were clearly opposed to any alliance with the Hittites. Following this, Egypt's ruling dynasty Akhenaten's line came to an end. power passed into the hands of high-ranking officials. Aya, a seasoned bureaucrat, took the throne and ruled for a few years, followed by the general Haramhab, who controlled Egypt for the next 2 decades. Meanwhile, Suppiluliuma sent one of his sons on a campaign in Syria to retaliate against Egypt and solidify Hittite control in the north. He strengthened his influence by placing royal family members as permanent representatives in key cities like Aleppo and Carchemish. However, not long after Suppilulium's death, a devastating plague swept through Hatti, claiming the life of his immediate successor. The next in line, Mursili II, was still quite young when he assumed the throne. According to his later annals. Other rulers initially dismissed him due to his age and inexperience. They said things like, "You're just a child who knows nothing. I have no respect for you. Your land is weakened. Your army and chariots are few. I have more troops and chariots than you do. Your father was strong, but you, a mere child, cannot." Compare during this period of perceived weakness. Client rulers across the region rebelled, including in central Syria. The king of Kadesh was among them. Mursili faced opposition not only from rebellious vassals, but also from rival powers like Assyria and Egypt, who encouraged the uprisings. Still, it took him 10 years, but he eventually re-established Hittite control across Syria, stretching from the Anatolian border to Kadesh. As a result, the northern territories that Egypt had once considered within its sphere of influence had now fallen under Hittite domination. Unsurprisingly, this shift displeased the Egyptian leadership. In 1292 BCE, Haramhab's former vizier, Ramesses I, founded a new dynasty. His family adopted the militant ideology of the long-deceased early rulers of Egypt's 18th dynasty. His son Seti I, who ruled from 1290 to 1279 BCE, launched campaigns into Palestine and then pushed northward into Kadesh and Amaru. He captured Kadesh and left a commemorative stele there, also claiming to have defeated a Hittite army in battle, though. This specific clash is not confirmed in other sources. These campaigns marked a renewed Egyptian attempt to roll back Hittite expansion in northern Syria. Alongside this northern push, Egypt also shifted its strategy in the south. Rather than maintaining loose diplomatic influence, the Egyptians began directly occupying southern Syria-Palestine. They established military outposts, administrative buildings, and other infrastructure to tighten their grip on the region. Egypt's political center was also relocated. After abandoning the city of Akhetanon during Tutankhamun's reign, the royal government moved to Memphis and began reviving older cities in the eastern Nile Delta. This process culminated under Ramesses II, who established a new capital in the eastern delta called Ramesses, meaning House of Ramesses. While Egypt was reasserting itself, the Hittites did not remain passive. Muwatalli II, who came to the throne in 1295 BCE following his father's reign, initially lost Kadesh and Amaru to Seti I. He also chose not to respond to Mitani ruler Wasasha-Ta's plea for help against Assyrian aggression, likely because his focus was on preparing for renewed conflict with Egypt in a bold move. Muwatalli relocated the Hittite capital from the traditional royal center of Hattusa to a new city in southern Anatolia called Terhun Tasa, though the exact site of this city remains unknown. Although no record directly states how, it is clear that he succeeded in regaining control of Amaru and Kadesh. By the time Ramesses II came to power, the Hittite-Egyptian border had shifted back south of Amaru. Ramesses II, who had been groomed for kingship by his father, assumed the throne. At a young age, he would go on to rule Egypt for an extraordinary 67 years. From 1279 to 1213 BCE, Ramesses II continued the military campaigns initiated by his father in Syrio-Palestine. Advancing north along the coast, he reached the distant port cities of Tyre and Byblos. On his return journey, he turned inland and once again forced the king of Amaru to realign with Egypt. The following year, his 5th as pharaoh, he returned with a large army, this time aiming to secure control over the inland routes. This campaign led directly to his famous confrontation with the Hittites at Kadesh. The battle that followed is considered the most thoroughly documented military clash in ancient Near Eastern history, primarily because of the wealth of Egyptian sources, both written and visual, that describe it in great detail. For historians, this wealth of material poses a unique challenge. Was the battle itself truly exceptional, or is it only the surviving depictions that are... Ramesses employed many familiar themes and artistic conventions typical of Egyptian royal propaganda. However, the sheer amount of detail makes his account stand out. The question remains, are these descriptions a more elaborate version of a typical battle, or do they reflect something genuinely extraordinary? It's clear that Ramesses wasn't aiming to provide an objective or accurate report. His accounts glorify him as a heroic warrior and almost certainly distort the true outcome. In reality, he did not win the battle and may have been fortunate just to survive it. Most modern scholars regard the encounter as a conventional late Bronze Age battle, albeit on a larger scale than most. Others argue that it was an exceptional event that disrupted the usual military norms of the time. Unfortunately, we don't have a detailed Hittite version of the story. Their perspective is only briefly mentioned in a later treaty, where they stated, "Then my lord Muwatalli and the king of Egypt fought over the territory of Amaru. Muwatalli defeated him, overpowered Amaru by force, and brought it under his control." Ramesses, however, offered a much more dramatic version of the events. According to him, as the Egyptian army moved north, it was organized into 4 divisions, stretched out in a long column. Local informants claimed the Hittites were still far to the north, so the lead division made camp near Kadesh. In reality, the Hittite army was concealed behind the city and launched a surprise flank attack on the Egyptian camp while Ramesses himself was inside it, caught off guard. The Egyptian troops panicked. Ramesses claimed that he alone rallied and fought off the attackers, defeating them single-handedly. He even said the Hittite king sent him a message asking for peace, to which he graciously agreed. Modern scholars are skeptical of this version. Reliefs show that reinforcements arrived from the coast and played a key role. They also point out that the Hittites began looting the Egyptian camp prematurely before the battle, over-suggesting they believed they had already won. Most experts now believe the battle ended in a draw, with both sides exaggerating their achievements. While Ramesses' depiction of the battle follows the typical Egyptian trope of the lone heroic king triumphing against impossible odds, the scale of the event was exceptional. His army came dangerously close to total destruction, and only a mix of his personal leadership, timely reinforcements, and the Hittites' overconfidence saved the day. At least one historian has argued that the Battle of Qadesh was highly unusual for another reason. The Hittites broke traditional rules of warfare. Instead of issuing a formal challenge or launching a direct attack, they set an ambush and struck from the side. In doing so, they reversed the expected roles of attacker and defender, turning aggression into their form of defense. From this perspective, the battle marked a breakdown of the diplomatic and military norms that had governed conflicts in the region. The unraveling of the broader international system may have been even more significant than the battle itself. The clash at Kadesh was unusual because it was a direct confrontation between two major powers, Egypt and the Hittites, fighting each other openly on the battlefield. According to Ramesses II, the Hittite forces numbered 47,500 men, including 3,500 chariots and 37,000 infantry. The Egyptian army was likely of comparable size. These figures are probably exaggerated, but there's no doubt that both sides committed enormous resources, treating this conflict as a decisive moment in their long-standing rivalry over control of the Border, Leandus. Before Kadesh, many battles had taken place across the Syro-Palestinian region and beyond, but they were of a different kind. Typically, a major state's army would attack smaller local powers. These local kingdoms might receive backing from great powers, but the major states themselves rarely engaged each other directly. This doesn't mean their territories were never violated. Both Egypt and Hatti had conducted raids deep into Mitani territory, but full-scale battles between superpowers were rare. Open-field battles were also uncommon. More often, fighting took the form of sieges, with armies surrounding fortified cities where defenders had retreated. At Kadesh, however, the Hittites didn't use the city as a defensive stronghold. Instead, they fought and defeated Ramesses in the open field. This may have been such a departure from the established norms of warfare that they couldn't, or chose not to, follow the usual diplomatic rules. Kadesh was a setback for Ramesses. It took him 2 years to recover and rebuild his position. He returned to Syrio-Palestine. His campaign focused on subduing rebellious southern states that had seized the opportunity created by his earlier defeat. By his 9th regnal year, he led an expedition that pushed far to the north, apparently without encountering Hittite resistance. This was likely because the Hittites were distracted by internal turmoil within their royal family and rising threats from the Assyrians in the east. Finally, in 1260 BCE, Ramesses II signed a peace treaty with the new Hittite king, Hattusili III, the brother of the late Muwatalli. The two leaders pledged to end their conflict and maintain peace. From that point on, both Kadesh and Amaro remained firmly under Hittite control. The Battle of Qadesh may have hinted at the collapse of the international system, but it wasn't the direct cause of its end. Nevertheless, within the next 100 to 150 years, nearly all the major states in the eastern Mediterranean would either vanish entirely or shrink dramatically in power, not due to conflict among themselves, but because of internal turmoil worsened by the arrival of new groups from outside the region. The end of any era is difficult to describe, often marked by chaos, and even harder to interpret. The decline of the Late Bronze Age has sparked over a century of scholarly debate. With conferences and books offering conflicting theories, some researchers see the changes as revolutionary and abrupt, while others emphasize long-term continuity and attribute the differences between the second and first millennia BCE to developments that happened well after 1200 BCE. What is clear is that many significant events occurred, though much of the detail remains murky. That's because, as cities collapsed, the written records they produced also disappeared. Here, I will outline some of the known facts, saving further interpretation for later discussion. By around 1250 BCE, the eastern Mediterranean appeared relatively stable and peaceful. The Mycenaean world had expanded to include parts of mainland Greece, the Aegean Islands, and parts of western Anatolia. The Hittites ruled over most of Anatolia and northern Syria west of the Euphrates River. Egypt held firm control over Nubia and Palestine. Assyria dominated northern Syria and Mesopotamia, stretching from the Euphrates in the west to the Zagros Mountains in the east. In Babylonia, a long-established Kassite dynasty was in power, while in nearby Elam, the royal family governed both the lowlands and highlands of the region. Though military conflict was always a possibility, generals were never short on ambition. The region had achieved a relatively balanced and stable geopolitical situation. A century later, that world had changed dramatically. Within another 100 years, it was gone entirely. So what happened? The Hittite kingdom, one of the best documented powers of the time and among those most severely affected, offers a useful case study. After the peace treaty with Egypt in 1260 BCE, the Hittites solidified their hold over northwestern Syria. By reaffirming their authority through renewed treaties with their client states, they fought a war against the island of Alatia, likely Cyprus, and brought it under their control. They also quelled unrest among their vassals in western Anatolia. While these external challenges were significant, the more serious problems came from within. Not long after the Battle of Qadesh, a dynastic dispute erupted within the Hittite royal family. This rivalry created lasting tension between two branches of the royal house, each rooted in a different region. When Muwatalli moved the capital from Hattusa to Tarhuntassa in the south, he established a second power center alongside the traditional one. Later, when Hattusili seized the throne, he returned to Hattusa and appointed his nephew Karanta to rule Tarhuntassa, giving him authority just below that of the crown prince. This arrangement effectively made the southern coast of Anatolia its own semi-independent political entity under a powerful client king. Hattusili's son, Tudaliya, later reaffirmed Karanta's status by signing a formal treaty engraved on a nearly 5-kilogram bronze tablet recently unearthed at Hattusa. But the uneasy power sharing didn't last. Karanta launched a coup, seizing Hattusa for a time until Tudalia recaptured it through military force. These internal upheavals may have continued to destabilize the Hittite kingdom, even as the last king, Suppiluliuma II, came to power in 1207 BCE. King Suppiluliuma II faced numerous difficulties during his reign. Some sources mention food shortages, while others suggest internal unrest within the Hittite heartland and growing instability among the kingdom's vassals. For instance, the king of Ugarit, a city on the northern Syrian coast, appeared to have opened diplomatic channels with both Assyria and Egypt, signs that central authority was weakening. Archaeological evidence shows that several major Hittite cities were destroyed or abandoned, though some remained intact. The capital, Hattusa, was completely deserted. Fires broke out in the royal citadel and other official buildings, signaling either internal conflict or organized attack. According to one Egyptian account, invading sea peoples overran the Hittite kingdom, however. Modern historians are skeptical of this claim. The destruction was not uniform, it varied by region and appears to have been selective. For example, Carchemish, a key city on the Euphrates, survived and later became the center of a new dynasty that upheld many Hittite traditions for generations. A similar pattern played out in the Mycenaean world. Texts from that time offered little help in understanding the turmoil, but archaeology reveals a patchwork of outcomes. Major fortified centers like Mycenae and Tiryns were destroyed, others were abandoned, and some like Argosaur remained inhabited. Although under harsher conditions, the decline didn't happen overnight. For decades before 1200 BCE, the Mycenaeans had been strengthening their defenses, likely in response to growing threats. Destruction occurred at different times and locations, not as part of a single coordinated collapse. There's also evidence that people from the Mycenaean world migrated eastward, including to Cyprus. Several Cypriot settlements were destroyed during this period, but some scholars argue that power on the island became more centralized around large coastal cities, leading to a kind of flourishing that lasted for about another century. In northern Syria, some of the Hittites' client states fared far worse. Ugarit, a major center of trade and diplomacy, was violently destroyed around 1200 BCE and never recovered. Yet nearby cities such as Byblos remained standing. In southern Syria and the Palestine region, people adopted new material cultures, relocated into hill country, or withdrew into lowland towns. These shifts are usually associated with the arrival of new groups, including the people later known as the Philistines, rulers of city-states along the Mediterranean coast at the same time. Egypt's grip over its Palestinian territories weakened significantly. With control largely limited to some areas near the Red Sea and the Sinai, pharaohs Merneptah reigned 1213 to 1204 BCE and Ramesses 311-87 to 1156 BCE both claim to have fought off invasions by Libyan forces and the so-called Sea Peoples, a loose confederation of foreign groups. In 1180 BCE, Ramesses III described how these Sea Peoples had already destroyed various kingdoms in Anatolia, such as Hatti, Tarhuntasa, and Arzawa, northern Syria, like Carchemish, and Cyprus-Alatia, before amassing in western Syria and launching an attack on Egypt by both land and sea. His account is dramatic, but ultimately unreliable. We now know that Carchemish and Alatia were not destroyed. Furthermore, the Sea Peoples he named had already been mentioned in earlier Egyptian records, sometimes even serving as mercenaries, including during the time of the Battle of Qadesh. Ramesses III presented their invasion as a sudden crisis. But even he referenced similar events a few years earlier. Merneptah had described comparable troubles almost 30 years before that. While historians offer different explanations for these inconsistencies, the Egyptian records simply cannot be trusted as accurate historical sources in this case. It's clear that Egypt went through a period of major upheaval during the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, after the death of Pharaoh Merneptah, who ruled from 1213 to 1204 BCE. Political infighting at the royal court led to a usurpation of the throne. At one point, a royal butler held real political control. This chaos may have led to civil war. It took the rise of a new ruling house, the 20th dynasty, to restore some order. All but the first pharaoh of this new dynasty took the name Ramesses, trying to evoke the glory of the famous Ramesses II, however. After Ramesses III, these kings achieved little: political unrest, economic decline, and the breakdown of law. An order led to Egypt's weakening both at home and abroad. Asterisk, by around 1080 BCE. Egypt had fragmented into 3 separate political regions. A later story from this era tells of a priest from Thebes named Wenamun who traveled to the Levant to buy wood. There, he found a world entirely different from the one Egyptian envoys would have encountered 2 centuries earlier. The local rulers no longer treated Egypt with deference. The Prince of Byblus, for example, mocked Wenamun's request for wood as a religious gift for the god Amen and demanded payment in advance. Byblus was no longer an obedient client of Egypt. It had become an independent trading partner. While the eastern Mediterranean fell into turmoil, regions farther east experienced a different kind of collapse. The easternmost major city to fall suddenly was Imar on the Euphrates, which was destroyed soon after 1187 BCE. Beyond that point, the collapse of political systems came more from internal conflict and warfare between rival states. In Assyria, the assassination of King Tukulti-Ninurta I in 1207 BCE ended the kingdom's aggressive military expansion. The administrative outposts that Assyria had established in northern Syria remained, but they became far less active. For the next 300 years, the historical record of Assyria is sparse. There simply aren't enough surviving texts to give a clear picture of what happened. Babylonia remained relatively stable until the middle of the 12th century, when kings from Elam to the east launched repeated invasions. These invasions eventually toppled the Kassite dynasty, which had ruled Babylon for centuries. In 1155 BCE, the Kassite kings were replaced by a new dynasty, likely based in the southern city of Isin. Archaeological evidence suggests the region went into economic decline during this time. Still, Babylonia saw a resurgence in the late 12th century under King Nebuchadnezzar I 1125 to 1104 BCE, who led a campaign to destroy Elam as revenge for its earlier attacks. Elam had been one of the last great powers of the Late Bronze Age to rise, and it was the last to fall, although it had enjoyed military success in Babylonia around 1155 BCE. These were raids rather than lasting conquests. 30 years later, Elam's last king was defeated by Nebuchadnezzar in a battle at the river Karun and forced to flee. The Babylonians looted the Elamite capital of Susa, and the Elamite ruler likely retreated to the eastern part of his realm. He was unable to recover, and by around 1100 BCE, Elam, like all its neighbors, had entered a period of silence, so deep that we know almost nothing about its history afterward. Asterisk. The collapse of the long-standing system in the eastern Mediterranean didn't happen overnight, but the changes it brought were profound. The powerful states that had once dominated the region either vanished or became significantly weaker. Economic activity plummeted. As a result, there were no major construction projects to leave lasting monuments. No royal scribes produced written records for future generations to read. Urban life diminished dramatically. Many people moved into small villages or adopted a more nomadic lifestyle, following herds of animals. New groups began to gain influence. Some had lived in the region all along but had previously lacked power, while others were newcomers. These included the Libyans in Egypt, the Arameans in Syria and Mesopotamia, the Persians in western Iran, the Philistines and Israelites in Palestine, and others. By the time historical records begin to reappear in the 10th century BCE, the eastern Mediterranean world had been reshaped. New people filled the vacuum left by the fallen empires. New technologies became common, like ironworking and alphabetic writing. Societies had changed, and new cultural traditions replaced the old ones. The world of the first millennium BCE was entirely different from what came before. Asterisk. Historians often concentrate on individuals who played roles within state structures, the central figures in the narratives we construct. This focus makes sense, as these individuals generated most of the written and archaeological records we rely on. They lived in towns and villages and depended on local farmers for sustenance. However, we must not overlook the many others who existed on the edges of this world, people who did not write or leave behind grand monuments. These peripheral populations lived both beyond and within the borders of the states we study. Beyond the frontier, distant groups interacted occasionally with the people of the Eastern Mediterranean. At the same time, within these states lived individuals who did not conform to the social norms of the text-producing elites. Although often viewed as outsiders or outcasts, they regularly engaged with the main figures of the time, foreigners and social outcasts. Frequently overlapped and shared lifestyles distinct from those in settled urban and rural communities. 2. The writers of historical texts, they were the other seen, but not fully understood. Still, these marginalized groups played an active role in shaping the history of the region. To ignore them would be a serious oversight. Even though they are difficult to study, it is essential that historians attempt to understand them, in many ways. The outside world had no real boundaries, and goods traveled astonishing distances. Spices like cinnamon and pepper from Southeast Asia made their way to Egypt. Lapis lazuli mined in Afghanistan was highly prized by elites throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. We cannot determine precisely how far these goods traveled, how long the journeys took, or how many intermediaries were involved. In the 3rd millennium BCE, traders from the Indus Valley reached Babylonian ports, although later evidence is sparse. The technology to make such voyages was still available in the late 2nd millennium. It's possible that people from the Near East ventured into the Indian Ocean, though no clear evidence confirms this. Meanwhile, inhabitants of Syrian coastal cities and Greece, renowned for their maritime expertise in the early 1st millennium, likely had the ability to reach the Western Mediterranean even earlier. In the late 2nd millennium, artifacts left behind show that Mycenaean sailors visited places like Italy and Mediterranean islands such as Sicily. None of the highly literate civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean left us detailed accounts of journeys to far-off places. The closest example we have is the written and visual record of an expedition sponsored by Queen Hatshepsut to a place known as Punt, believed to have been located somewhere along the Red Sea coast of East Africa. The Egyptians portrayed Punt as a mysterious and foreign land, populated by people with unfamiliar appearances, living in a strange natural setting and unusual houses. Punt held a sense of fascination and wonder for the Egyptians. An earlier Egyptian story, considered one of the earliest pieces of travel fiction, offers another glimpse into this fascination with distant lands. The story of the shipwrecked sailor, known from a single manuscript dating to the early 2nd millennium BCE, tells of a sailor who, while traveling down the Red Sea, ends up on an island inhabited by a giant talking snake. The snake recounts the tragic tale of its family's death caused by a falling star and predicts that the sailor will return home in 2 months, implying a journey of great distance. Still, these faraway contacts are not the focus here. Instead, the concern lies with the more immediate periphery. The Eastern Mediterranean was surrounded by regions where life differed greatly from that of the central. Urbanized states, due largely to environmental conditions, in the deserts surrounding Egypt and those between Mesopotamia and Syrio-Palestine, as well as in the mountainous areas of Iran, eastern Anatolia, Transjordan, and northern Greece, permanent year-round settlements were difficult to sustain. In many cases, only small communities could exist, and the urban lifestyle familiar to the core regions was simply not possible. But these peripheral zones weren't only outside state borders. Within each state, there were also areas where agriculture and settlement were limited. In some places, there wasn't enough rainfall. The soil was poor, or the terrain made irrigation with canals impossible. These regions varied widely and included hills, steppes, and deserts. Despite the challenges, these areas were not empty. They were home to communities that maintained important, though often complex and uneasy, relationships with the rulers and urban populations at the heart of the states. These interactions between core and periphery were essential to the region's history. Although difficult to study, they're crucial for understanding the broader dynamics of the ancient Eastern Mediterranean world and should not be overlooked. Asterisk, asterisk. One group from the Late Bronze Age that clearly illustrates the complex ties between the core states and their surrounding margins was known as the Habiru. It's also spelled Habiru or Abiru, though scholars continued to debate the correct form. The origin of the word suggests meanings like one who has left his home, implying a refugee, exile, or migrant. Scribes often wrote the name using the Sumerian or Babylonian terms for murderer or thief, indicating how these people were viewed. Although the term Habiru had existed for a long time, it was during the latter part of the 2nd millennium BCE that the group became especially significant in the Syro-Palestinian region. Mentions of the Habiru can be found in cuneiform records across the Near East, in the Levant, at places like Kumadu, Kubret, Alalik, and in cities that contributed to the Amarna letters. In Anatolia, at Hattusa, in northern Mesopotamia, at Nuzi, and in the southern Mesopotamian cities of Nippur and Babylon. The Egyptians also used the term in their hieroglyphic inscriptions. Who exactly were the Habiru? In the 19th century, many scholars believed the name referred to an ethnic group related to the Hebrews. That theory has since been largely dismissed. Today, most scholars view the Habiru as a broad category used for people who had become detached from their original tribal or urban communities. They are often seen as a third force, neither fully settled nor fully nomadic. Asterisk, asterisk, in both tribal and urban contexts. Individuals or small groups could leave their communities for various reasons: poverty, criminal activity, or political exile. This kind of departure wasn't limited to the lower classes, it even happened among elites. One notable example is Igrimi, a prince from Aleppo, who tells of abandoning his home and living among the Habiru for 7 years. He recounts, "I took my horse, my chariot, and my servant, and set out for the desert. I joined the Sutian warriors and spent the night with them. The next day, I continued on to the land of Canaan, staying in the town of Amia. People from Aleppo, Mukish, Naya, and Amay were living there. When they discovered I was the son of their former ruler, they gathered around me. I lived among the Habiru for 7 years. This story reflects how even individuals of high status could become part of the loosely defined world of the Habiru. Afterward, Igrimi sought support from the king of Mitani, who appointed him as ruler of Alalak. It's worth emphasizing that Igrimi made a conscious choice to live among the Habiru. He wasn't born into that group. Likewise, his return to urban society was his own decision. Many fugitives found refuge among Habiru communities. Once part of these groups, sources describe them as adopting a few defining traits. They were often seen as aggressive and uncontrollable. This reputation is especially evident in the Amarna letters. In one letter to the Egyptian king, Assyrian, Mayer reported, "The Habiru captured Gilunu, a city belonging to the king, my lord. They looted it, set it on fire, and barely a single household survived." This kind of negative portrayal shouldn't surprise us. Throughout Mediterranean and world literature, people living on the margins of society have typically been depicted as dangerous or immoral. Over time, the names given to such groups remained remarkably consistent. Where 2nd millennium BCE writers referred to Habiru as refugees, S.A.Gaz as murderers, or Habatu as thieves. Later authors in the 2nd millennium CE used words like Foricidi, Banditi, and Ladroterms, meaning outlaws, bandits, or thieves. In all cases, they were seen as social misfits or outsiders. Despite this negative image, the relationship between settled societies and the Habiru was not entirely hostile. In fact, the Habiru were often valued as ideal candidates for mercenary work. Throughout history, displaced people have made effective soldiers because their loyalty typically lies with their employers rather than with any family, tribe, city, or nation. As a result, Habiru were incorporated into the armies of Syro-Palestinian states, and among the Hittites, the term came to be broadly associated with mercenaries. They even had a patron deity. The Egyptians also made use of the Habiru, particularly in Nubia. 2 letters discovered in Kumadu in present-day Lebanon show the Egyptian king requesting his local governors in Damascus and Shazina to send me the Habiru, about whom I wrote earlier. I plan to resettle them in the cities of the land of Cush-Nubia, to take the place of those I have deported. This reveals how the Habiru were not only feared and distrusted, but also actively recruited and relocated as a useful labor and military force within the state system. In the competitive political landscape of Syro-Palestine, many states sought to use the Habiru to their advantage. These displaced groups were organized and turned against the very rulers they had once served or fled from. Rabahata of Byblos, for example, repeatedly complained to the Egyptian king that Abdi-Ashirta of Amaru was using the Habiru against him. He wrote that the Habiru and chariots have been stationed at the gate of Byblos and have not moved, and warned that all the king's lands up to Egypt's borders will fall to the Habiru. He even reported that all the Habiru have been gathered together to attack me. It appears that nearly every army in the Syro-Palestinian region made use of Habiru fighters. Military rosters from Alalak list large numbers of them. One record mentions 1,436 soldiers, including 80 charioteers. In letters to the Egyptian overlord, local rulers often reported that their Habiru troops were doing well, indicating that these fighters held a distinct and valued place within their forces. However, the Habiru were not the only such group. They were part of a much broader array of marginalized or peripheral peoples mentioned in late Bronze Age texts. To the authors of these texts, all such groups were treated in much the same way. They were portrayed as fundamentally different, even opposite, to the settled and civilized world the writers represented. These outsiders were viewed not only as strangers, but as the negation of the author's own identities. This raises important questions. What can we truly learn about these people? To what extent was the image presented by the texts accurate, or simply a reflection of elite biases and fears?